Hi, my name is Jane Sturmer, and I'm going to be presenting a little short video on how to select good studies for your EBP papers. Just a little background, I was an EBP tutor at BTC's nursing program for several years, and a lot of the problems that I saw people having could have been fixed with just choosing studies that were better adapted to the kinds of papers they were trying to write. So I'm going to talk a little bit about different kinds of studies and sort of what to look for when selecting them. Um, so the paper itself will be way easier to write if you have the right kind of study. There are certain forms of studies that just don't fit well with the kind of paper that we're writing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those. Hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll know sort of how to tell the different kinds apart and what you should be looking for. But first thing you got to do is pick your topic. Choose something that is pertinent or interesting to you, because otherwise the paper is just going to be a slog. For this little mini example, chose early mobilization after surgery because I'm a surgical nurse, and that's something that we talk about a lot on my floor. So say I wanted to do some research on that topic. I would go to a database of some kind. I usually use National Institutes of Health, and I would type in early mobilization after surgery and just see what comes up. And if I were to actually do that, I would probably see a lot of studies that talk about like hip fracture or joint surgery, geriatric patients, and how early mobilization decreases length of stay or reduces delirium. And so that gives me an idea of sort of the variables that they are measuring in terms of early mobilization after surgery. So say I wanted to know more about a particular part of that, I would sort of change my search terms and narrow it down so that I can get a bunch of studies that are focused on just one aspect of that question. So I could talk about the ERAS protocol, which is a protocol that was developed to improve recovery from surgery. I could search for like hip fractures specifically or delirium, whatever it is you're searching for. Just choose some of the variables that seems like have been studied a bit and include those in a new search so that you can find more studies on those variables, because you want some studies that have related features that you can compare and contrast. Because what you're looking for is several studies that can give you an idea of what the scientific consensus is on a particular topic. So you don't want to find some studies that are talking about like, sleep, but totally different aspects of sleep. Like you need similar variables. And just keep tweaking your search terms until you find enough studies on things that are close enough to each other that you can sort of talk about them in relation to each other. Um, so yeah, that's basically what I just said. For search places, I would go to the BTC library webpage if you're looking for databases that are free or, we have access to. If you work at the hospital also has a library page that has a lot of options. I pretty much exclusively during nursing school used PubMed through the National Institutes of Health. They have nice little abstracts that make it really clear ahead of time, like what a study is about, and they have lots of free access articles, and I was always able to find enough stuff for my paper on that website. It's just the easiest to use, I think. But if you're going to go hunting around for articles in other places, just make sure that they are from like a reputable source. Don't choose like news articles or personal media or anything like that. Go with journals is my best recommendation. Academic journals are peer reviewed by nature. And so you know that you're going to get a more rigorous scientific study on there. So some factors to consider once you have, a pool of studies that you're trying to choose from. You want to think about what kind of evidence each study is. And I would just go through and like answer all of these questions really quick on your studies. But what kind of evidence? Is it actually a study? Because I read a few papers back in my day that were talking about things that were not studies. And that makes it really hard to write a paper that makes sense. Um, Expert opinions, those are not studies. You can't write about those. A meta-analysis or a systematic review is not a study. It's a review of studies, so that doesn't work. So make sure that you actually have, a question and then some variables, a sample population, and all of the features of a study, like a bunch of scientists trying to determine the answer of a question by doing an experiment, because that's what you want to be able to talk about in your literature review section. Those are like required features of that part of the paper. So make sure that you have a study that has those things. And then you also want to think about if the study is using quantitative or qualitative data. Qualitative data can be useful, but it is not measurable and it's much more subjective. And so it's harder to compare to other data sources, and it is not as reliable in terms of like answering an actual question. Quantitative data, which is measurable, generally like numerical, is a lot easier to compare and define, and it is less open to the interpreter's bias. You also want to look at sample size of the population. Ideally, you want a population that is as representative of, the entire human race as possible. So the bigger the better, the more diverse the better. And I'm talking like racial diversity, economic diversity, geographical diversity, cultural. I mean, just as diverse as you can get is better. And then also you want to pay attention to, again, the variables that are being researched. What aspects of your topic are actually being measured, and can you compare them to the other studies easily? And then be aware of bias in the study. Do your researchers seem like they are over or under reporting the data? Do they seem like they're overstating the importance of the data? I think there is a fair amount of bias because everybody wants their study to be important, but not all studies are. And so just be aware of that. Conflicts of interest, don't use a study about how sugar isn't that bad from Coca-Cola, obviously. And then, has the research been peer reviewed? Look and see if it has ever been cited or if it's published in an academic journal. Those are good indications of peer review. And then you also want a relatively recent study. Less than 5 years old, I believe, was the rule when I was in nursing school. So any older than that, and you might want to consider either getting a new one or talking to the teacher about how appropriate it is. So this is the pyramid of evidence. At the top, we have the systematic review, which is the highest level of evidence, and that's because it incorporates a variety of evidence sources. And then as you go down the pyramid, you have less and less sort of reliable, measurable, and controlled types of evidence. So for the purposes of our paper, we're probably going to be looking at, number 2, 3, and 4 there, the randomized controlled trials, the non-randomized trials, and the cohort studies. Things like that are sort of what we are looking for. Anything below that you want to be a little bit careful with, and I'll talk about each of these things in more detail. So yeah, the best forms of evidence are the systematic reviews, the randomized controlled trials, non-randomized, and then cohorts. So systematic reviews are super useful for your purposes if you are trying to answer some sort of question just for your own research, or if you are trying to find a good well of studies that you can look at. Because what a systematic review is a researcher will compile all of the latest evidence on a particular topic and then just talk about it. They'll compare and contrast it. They'll talk about sort of what the general scientific consensus is at that moment in time. That's basically what we're trying to do with our EBP paper, which is why it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us to write about a review, is because we are writing reviews ourselves. But I will say that reading a review is super useful if you're trying to find sources, or if you, just as part of your practice in the future, you have a question that you're trying to answer. So yeah, I highly recommend getting used to reading these, but for the purposes of the paper, don't use this as your study. Randomized controlled trials are like the gold standard. it's where you have research groups randomly assigned to two separate groups, and then you have like an experimental group and a control. The experimental group gets whatever intervention we're studying, and the control group is unchanged, and then you compare the results. So, like, for example, if you want to find out if a particular, I don't know, like heart medication works, you would give one group of patients a placebo, and you would give another group of patients a control, and then you would see if there's any difference in the outcomes. And ideally, it's blinded, like you don't, the participants don't know if they're on the placebo or the actual thing, because that can skew the results as well. These are great sources of evidence. If you can find some of these, that would be excellent. But they're not always practical for specific kinds of questions. Sometimes you want to do like a non-randomized trial, and that's where your sample population is kind of already in a natural group, depending on the situation. So, like, if a hospital agrees to do a trial of a particular intervention, like my hospital is doing the ERAS protocol for certain kinds of surgeries, that is not technically randomized because it is everybody who goes to my hospital for a certain kind of surgery. And so it's a natural community. It's not randomized. There's no like control necessarily. And so this kind of study can be more useful, or it's more practical. More people are likely to engage in this kind of study because it's easier to do. And sometimes there are also ethical concerns with randomization. Like sometimes, you don't want to deny a certain portion of the population a treatment if there's an opportunity for it to work. And so you'll just give it to everybody who's trying it. Cohort studies are also pretty good, especially if there was like a particular event or like an exposure to something. You can sort of measure everybody exposed to that thing's reaction to it over time. So, like, for example, people who were exposed to radiation during the bombings in Japan, like you can follow that cohort and see how that level of exposure to radiation affected their lifespan. Or like people who ate a certain food that it turned out was toxic. You can follow them over time. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons that you might want to do a cohort study, and they're really useful because of their longevity. I mean, it's great to see how long-term effects of certain things can pan out over the years. But they are by their nature a little bit more narrow because it's hard to get a big enough cohort. And so these are the kinds of studies that you want to be a little bit cautious with on this slide. Cross-sectional studies, which is basically like a survey. These don't determine anything causal. They just can show what traits are being exhibited in the population at that time. So like you might send a survey to a bunch of people in the winter to see if they're depressed, and then send them in the summer and see if they're less depressed. It's not safe to conclude that the summer versus the winter is what's causing the changing levels of depression. You can just say that they are correlated. You can't determine causality from that kind of study. Qualitative studies are also something you should be a little bit cautious with, just because they don't have numerical data, and so it's a lot easier for the researcher to interpret it in a way that you wouldn't necessarily interpret it, or somebody else wouldn't. But when you do your like spiritual papers, I think in fourth quarter, sometimes qualitative studies can be a little bit more useful because there are certain topics that it's very hard to quantitatively measure. And that involves things like thoughts and feelings of spirituality and stuff like that. So I used a qualitative study for my paper during that quarter. Case studies are also probably not super useful for this. That is where the researcher will just focus on one individual case. So it could be like somebody who has a really rare genetic disorder, and they would just focus on interviewing that person and sort of measuring the outcomes for that person. It doesn't say very much about how things affect an entire population, and it can't determine causality because it's just looking at one case. So yeah, focus on randomized controlled trials, non-randomized controlled trials, and cohort studies if at all possible. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to email me. I am no longer your EBP tutor, but I might come back at some point, and I'm still free to answer questions. So yeah, good luck.